Hey folks, this is Mark with Eigen Designs and welcome back to my channel. I've got a great shop project that I'll be working on today where I'm going to be repurposing my downdraft table that is built into my workbench and making a router table using some of the top of the line equipment. In this video, I'll be covering the construction of the housing and the tabletop, as well as the steps that I took to hook up my dust collection, which has given some pretty good results. I'm also going to cover the setup and basic operation of a router table and cover a pretty embarrassing mistake that I made. Let's go. Before we hop into the construction of the router table housing, I thought it would be helpful to talk about why I'm replacing my downdraft table. This was one of my first videos I ever made on YouTube, and I thought it was really clever to build it inside my workbench. And I plumbed it up to my dust collection that I have in my shop, and it functioned very well. At the time, I was using a DeWalt sander, which generated a lot of dust, and so the downdraft table was helpful. But part of the contract of being a woodworking YouTuber is that you have to have Festool products. As a result, whenever you pair the Festool sanders with the dust collection, or the extractor as they call it, you really don't have very much fine dust. And in one of my Rotex 150 reviews, I actually showed that it creates very little dust, and that 99.9% of the dust gets extracted by the Festool extractor. So I found myself not using the downdraft table, and I thought I would repurpose this with a router table, which I absolutely would use. So step one in this project is to remove the existing downdraft dust collection box because it's not deep enough to house the router lift. Removing this is a little bit tough because I did not have access to the right set of screws that were holding the downdraft box to the workbench. So it got kind of violent there for a little bit, but I did get it out, and I replaced it with a box that was narrower and deeper to better suit the function of a router housing. I then took my fence and got a rough idea of where I wanted the router lift to be and began creating a box around it. I will splash the dimensions up on the screen here in just a second, but I made this out of 3/4 inch plywood. Definitely don't need that. It's probably overkill for what I'm doing, but I did have some lying around the shop and I decided to use that. I used some parallel clamps to hold everything in place while I took the flanged dust collection port, which is going to be installed on the outside edge of this particular box, and got a rough idea of where I wanted to cut the hole. Now there's a lot of ways to cut hole in plywood, but watchers of my channel know that I'm going to use my CNC any chance I get. So I cut out the 4-inch hole using my CNC, and then I clean up the edge of that surface using a chamfer bit. To secure the box together, I'll be using a combination of wood glue and some 18 gauge brad nails. I then secured the flanged 4-inch dust collection port to the back side of the box using some screws. I then used some 1.5-inch star drive wood screws to secure the box to the bottom of my workbench. Once the box was secured to the workbench, I then installed this top plate using some brad nails and then ran a bead of caulking on the inside seams of the box to minimize air loss through the cracks. I then put the workbench back together so I could turn my attention to actually building the router table itself. I'll be using some top-of-the-line hardware in the build today. The fence is a 36-inch router table fence made by Woodpeckers. The router table lift is made by Jessam, and it's their Master Lift 2. And the router itself is going to be the 1617 Bosch 2¼ horsepower router. All of these items will be linked in the description below if you want to go and check them out. Installing the router into the router lift is pretty straightforward. There is a configuration table within the instruction manual that tells you for the router you have what hole combination do you have to get the clamping blocks to fit the router just perfectly. And I was able to get the router in the clamping blocks within about 5 minutes. Once it's in there, you then have a screw that you tighten down to hold everything in place, and you're good to go. Building the router tabletop is probably the most intimidating part of the build because the tolerances for the actual inset for where the router needs to go are pretty tight. In this particular case, I'm using a series of painter's tape as well as my fence to outline where I want the center of the router lift to go. Once I have that position marked, I then turn my router lift housing upside down and center the collet right over the center of that point. Once that's in position, I use some painter's tape and a Sharpie to mark out where this is going to go. I'm going to be taking all these measurements and transferring them into my CNC software to cut it out using my CNC. But for those who don't have a CNC, there is a template that you can buy for about 35 bucks that can actually create this exact pattern using a normal router with a bushing installed with it. I use a set of digital calipers to get an exact thickness measurement of the router lift tabletop, which is about 0.4, because whenever we cut, we're going to cut a little bit deeper than that so that we can use the nylon leveling screws to actually set the lift top exactly flush with the tabletop that we're about to build. So by going a little bit deeper, you can use the leveling screws to make everything work. One tip, if you're looking to make this on your CNC, the radius of curvature on the outside corners is 3/4 of an inch. I looked all over the internet, couldn't find anything, and then I ultimately found it in the owner's manual that it's spelled out there. 3/4 of an inch is the magic radius of curvature to give you a nice seamless fit, and you'll see that come together in just a second. Now I'm applying some Aura Mask here for 2 reasons. One is to reduce the chip out of the melamine surface during the CNC carve, but 2, I'll be spray painting the exposed wood a black color to reduce visibility once everything is done. While my CNC is doing its thing, I decide to turn my attention to installing the on-off switch for the router. This will allow me to quickly turn off the router with my leg or with my knee if I'm using it and need to turn it off quickly. I then drilled a hole in the bottom of the router housing box to allow the cable to be fed up from the bottom. I had to cut it big enough to fit the plug through, which left a pretty big hole, and I didn't want to fill that hole with a bunch of silicone or caulking or anything like that. So I built a little U-shaped bracket that fit over the hole and secured it in place with some wooden screws to cover most of the open hole that was there. Once the CNC work was done, I grabbed the router housing to do a quick test fit, and it was perfect. With the Aura Mask still on the tabletop, I apply 1 coat of black spray paint to all the exposed wood just so that it doesn't draw any extra attention to it. To secure the T-track in place, we're going to be using some 5-minute epoxy to hold it in place. There's only about 1/4 or maybe even 3/8 of an inch of material left in this particular piece of melamine, so it's really not big enough to securely hold any T-track in place. So epoxy is a really good application for this. The one suggestion I would make, which I did not do, is to use a little bit of painter's tape to cover the holes on the bottom so the epoxy does not seep through the T-track. To secure the router lift to the tabletop, I'll be using some threaded inserts that have the same thread pattern as the Allen bolts that come with the Jessam router lift. To do that, I mark the center with a hole punch and then use a drill bit and some threaded inserts to fit each one of the holes. I'll have a link to these threaded inserts in the description below if you want to check them out. Once all the threaded inserts were installed, I did a quick test fit with the Allen keys from the router lift to make sure that everything fit properly. But I don't secure them in place just yet because we have to use the leveling screws to make sure that the router lift is level with the table. There's a total of 10 leveling screws in this design, which is why we cut the depth of this particular pocket a little bit deeper so that you can use the leveling screws to get it just right. Anyone who's ever used a router knows how much dust they create, so dust collection is going to be really key. This design has a 2.5-inch dust collection port coming off the fence, and then there's a 4-inch dust collection port on the underside of the router table housing. I'm showing you a picture of the final product here so you can understand the steps that we're going to take to create the dust collection on this particular design. I start off by drilling a 2.5-inch hole directly behind the dust port on the fence.
A few moments later.
And I want to thank those of you who are still watching at this point in the video, and I want to offer my 4 downdraft panels to any of my viewers who are interested in them. If this would be a nice addition to your shop, then just start your comment with the word downdraft and I'll know that you're interested. If more than one person is interested, then I'll just do a drawing at the end of the month. That's July of 2022. And I will ship them anywhere in the world that you are. So just enter a comment starting with downdraft and I'll know that you're interested. Okay, now that we've got our 2.5-inch hole cut and cleaned up with a nice chamfered edge, I use that black spray paint again just to color any exposed wood a darker color so it just doesn't catch your eye as easily, and I pull off the melamine and painter's tape. I then use some 2.5-inch clear tubing and a coupling to make everything fit together. That coupling is just wide enough to allow it to sit on top of the table. I used a 4-inch Y on the underside of the table to hook everything together, so you've got strong dust collection coming from behind the fence and below the router bit itself. I'll do a quick test cut here in a second, but I grabbed a handful of wood shavings just to see how good the suction was, and it got almost everything. With all the equipment installed, it's now time to do a setup and function test of everything. I start off by checking the router table fence for square, and both the in-feed and the out-feed fence were both square to the table, which is a good start. I then did a quick function test of the on-off switch to make sure that the emergency stop was working if I ever needed to use it. With both of those things confirmed, it was time to install a router bit into the table. The bit that I've chosen is a 1/2-inch shank, and I have the 1/2-inch collet installed on the router. Now, as you're tightening this router bit in place, make sure you lift it up about 1/8 of an inch so that the fillet on the underside of the bit is free and clear of the collet. That way you're tightening around the shank of the bit and not near the fillet. I used some offset wrenches to help me tighten down the bit underneath the router lift. I then select an insert ring to fit the bit size that we just selected. You don't want it to be a 0 clearance, but it does need to fit the bit snugly enough to where your workpiece doesn't fall downwards as you're moving it across the router bit. I then tighten the insert ring using the tool provided with the router lift. To move the fence into place, I loosen the knobs on the back part of the fence, which allows the fence to slide along the T-track rails that have been installed on the tabletop. I use a 3-foot level to ensure that the fence is in line with the bearing of the bit, and then I tighten down the knob to secure the fence in place. The Jessam Master Lift 2 comes with 2 mechanisms that can be actuated from the top sides. One raises and lowers the spindle, the other locks out the spindle. The bit can be raised by installing the hex wrench attachment into the mechanism and rotating clockwise. A 1/4 of a turn corresponds with 1/64 of an inch increase. So you can have very fine-tuned adjustments, both moving up and down to lock in the right measurement. Once you've got your router bit dialed into where you want it to be, you can take that same hexagonal wrench and take it over to the spindle lock to lock the spindle. This will ensure your router bit height doesn't change and that the first cut you make is the exact same as the last cut you make. To adjust the sacrificial fence, loosen the black screws on the back side of the fence, which allows it to be slid backwards and forwards. To make it truly sacrificial, you can move those fences into the bit to where it's making contact to create a zero clearance cut. I'm just going to get it close enough for today because we don't need a zero clearance cut to test it out. I made a few test cuts using a scrap piece of walnut that I had lying around, and I was amazed by how good the dust collection was for this particular system. I'm removing a fair bit of material with these passes, and there's just no dust that's left behind with this router table. And after making about half a dozen cuts, you can see that there's almost no wood chips laying around the router table. I didn't clean this up. This is just a pan shot exactly as it was after I made the cuts. So pretty impressive. But here's the mistake I made. If you look as I'm running my board through, it catches on the T-track inlaid into the tabletop. And in hindsight, there's really no reason for the T-track to come down that low because the fence would never need to go that far. Where the T-track is right now is about as far as it would ever need to run, and it certainly wouldn't need to extend past the fence. So I will likely recut this with a new piece of melamine and shorten the T-track length. But besides that one issue, I am very happy with the project. The dust collection definitely exceeded my expectations, and the adjustability on the router lift table is going to be a game changer for my woodworking projects. That's going to be it for this one. I really hope you enjoyed this content. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you on the next one.